Video, we want to review quadratics. Specifically, we're looking at solving quadratic equations by the methods listed. So first, let's look at solving by factoring. So when we solve by factoring, what we're trying to do is use the zero product property. And the zero product property just says that if you multiply two values and their product is zero, either the first factor is zero or the second factor is zero. Or they could both be zero. But based off of that, when we go ahead and we do problem number 1, we have to make sure that first it's set equal to 0 before I factor it. And if it is, I can go ahead and factor it into y minus 15 times y plus 2 equals 0. And so because the product of this factor and this factor is 0, then y minus 15 is 0 or y plus 2 is 0. Which gives me 15 and negative 2 as my possible solutions. So on the second one, I have to first get it equal to 0. Then I factor out a 2. And I go ahead and I finish factoring. So I set each factor equal to 0. Now remember, a constant can't be equal to 0, so I just throw that out. So that will give me x equals negative 8 or x equals 3 as my solutions. So again, when you're solving by factoring, you have to have the equation with a 0 on one side. So our steps are set the equation equal to 0, factor, set each factor equal to 0, and then solve for the variable. Okay, when we're solving by square roots, what we're trying to do is usually what's going to be happening is we don't have a linear expression. In other words, we don't have a variable to the first power. So we just want to go ahead and we want to get that quadratic term by itself first. So for example, in this one, we would add 81 to both sides. Okay, and at that point, I want to get the d squared by itself. So I'm going to divide both sides by 16. And so now I have d squared equals 81 over 16. And now I'm going to do the inverse of squaring, which is to do the square root. And remember, I don't know if it was a positive number I squared or not. So I'm going to do plus or minus. The square root of 81 is 9. The square root of 16 is 4. So my solutions are 9/4 and negative 9/4. Let's do number 8. Okay, so negative 7s squared equals 1 take away 10. Divide both sides by negative 7. And now I do the square root of both sides, remembering to do plus or minus. So I get s is plus or minus the square root of 9 over the square root of 7. Well, the square root of 9 is easy, it's 3. But the square root of 7 is just the square root of 7. So remember, technically, we don't like radicals in the denominator. So we multiply by square root of 7 over square root of 7, which gives me 3 square root of 7 over 7. So my solutions are plus or minus 3 square root of 7 over 7. Okay, completing the square probably is the one that's most annoying to people. So what we first do is we get all our variable terms in the quadratic on the left. Everything else on the right. So we separate. Then we're going to get rid of any coefficients of x squared by dividing everything by that number, if there is something. Then we complete the square by taking that b value, dividing it by 2, squaring it, and add it to both sides. And what should happen is we should get a perfect square trinomial on the left, which we can then factor very easily, and then use square roots. So let's go ahead and put that into practice. So looking at number 15, there, I have negative k squared minus 8 equals 10k. So I know that I need 10k to be on the same side. I want k squared to be positive, so I'm going to multiply everything by negative 1. So that's k squared plus 8 equals negative 10k. And now I want this to be on that side, and I want this to be over here. So I had k squared plus 10k equals negative 8. So now I'm going to go ahead and look for my b. Well, b is 10. So I'm going to do b divided by 2 squared. So that's 10 over 2 to the second power, which is 5 squared, which is 25. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 25 on the left, and I'm going to do 25 on the right. Because I can go ahead and I can add something to both sides, and it's still a balanced equation. Now I'm going to go ahead and factor the left side. Well, these are both perfect squares. Square root of 25 is 5. 5 plus 5 makes 10, so I know it factors to k plus 5 squared. So that number is equal to that b over 2. And so the middle term is positive, so that's why I put a plus in the middle. And negative 8 plus 25 is 17. So now I can do my square roots, and I can get a solution. So I'm going to do square root of both sides, remembering plus or minus. Square root cancels a square. K plus 5 is either positive square root of 17 or negative 17. But I got to get k by itself, so I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. So that would give me negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 17. Okay, let's go ahead and we're going to do number 16. So first of all, I want to get all my x terms, I should say, on the same side, constants on the opposite side. So rather than divide out everything, I'm going to factor out a 6 on the left. So I get x squared, and then when I factored out a 6 from the 3, I'm left with a half. So now I have two possibilities. I could go ahead and divide both sides by 6, or I could go ahead and leave that 6 there for a moment. I'm going to go ahead and, to make my life easier, I'm just going to go ahead and divide both sides by 6, which just basically gives me negative 9 over 6. But since both of those are divisible by 3, I would get negative 3 over 2. Okay, so now my b is negative 1/2. So I'm going to take b over 2, negative 1 over 2, divided by 2, and square it. So remember, when you divide by 2, it's just going to give me 2 times 2 in the bottom. And then when I square it, I get positive 1/16. So that's what I'm going to add. Add 1/16, and whenever I do to one side, I got to do the other. And now I can go ahead and factor, because I'm going to get a perfect binomial square. Because of that minus 1/2, I know the middle is minus. X times x makes x squared, and I squared 1/4. Now over here, I just have to do a little bit of arithmetic. Negative 3 over 2, when I make it over 16, 2 times 8, 3 times 8. Negative 24 plus 1 is negative 23 over 16. Okay, so now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And now we haven't talked about imaginary numbers this year, but don't forget that when you take the square root of a negative, the square root of a negative 1 is I. So we get plus or minus I, square root of 23, and the square root of 16 is 4. So the last thing to do is add 1/4 to both sides. So I get 1 over 4 plus or minus I square root of 23 over 4. Another way to write that would be 1 plus or minus I square root 23 over 4.